Hey guys, this is Benny Ricciardi with rotocurve.com, and I'm here with our DraftKings NBA tips during the All-Star break. The next tip that we're going to get into today is going to be about using the Vegas lines. What we're going to try to talk about here is, the different types of lines that you see and what they can tell us about not only the way a game is going to play out, but which guys we should be targeting in those games for fantasy. So let's call up the slideshow and we can get into the different types of games we're going to talk about. There's basically four types of games that, we're going to see on any given night. We're going to see games with a high total and a low spread. We're going to see games with a low total and a high spread. We're going to see games with low totals and low spreads, and we're going to see games with high totals and high spreads. Now, each one of these four types of games has a different set of players that we would look to be targeting in those games. So what we're going to try to do is talk about, each one and which players would be the ones that you want to be looking at in those certain types of games. Now, before we get into that, I do want to say that everything here is relative. If you're playing on a Thursday night slate that only has 4 games and, 3 of those games happen to be Golden State, the Washington Wizards, and the Sacramento Kings, all of those games are going to have totals of 210 or 215. So on a night like that, if you have a total of 200 points, that could be one of the low totals on the day. So that would be one of the ones that we're talking about here. You could have another night where, let's say the next Thursday night, some of the teams that are playing include the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Utah Jazz and the Brooklyn Nets, teams that tend to play in games with lower totals in the 190s or even down into the 180s. On a night like that, if you're having the same game that's, 202, 203 points, that was the low total game on on the last Thursday night, 203 could wind up being a high total game on this night. So usually games over 200 are in good spots. Games under 200 are usually ones you want to have concern about. The further away from that 200 number, the more concern to the upside or the downside you want to have. So if a total is 220, that's obviously going to be a very good game to target. If the total is only 180, like, maybe a Brooklyn Nets versus Utah Jazz game would be sometimes, that's a game that you really want to try to avoid and stay away from because it's so, the total's so low. So just keep in mind that when we talk about totals and spreads here, it's all kind of relative. Totals definitely more than spreads. Spreads, anything below 7 points is usually a good spot. Anything above 10 points is usually something that we would consider a high spread that we want to be cautious about. Anything 7 is probably the number below or above it if you wanted to have a hard and fast number, but it's not always that cut and dry when you get down to it in the end. So let's talk about the first type of game that can come up, and that's a game that is a high total game, so maybe 215, 220, 230 points, and a low spread, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points, something like that. The reason for this is it's going to be the ideal game that we look for to target. A high total means that, there's going to be a lot of points scored. The more points scored, the more assists there are on some of those buckets. The pace is usually faster. There's usually more missed shots, so that's more rebounds. So all those things, the increased points, the increased assists, the increased rebounds, the increased possessions or pace that we always talk about, it's just going to be more chances for the guys who we roster from that game to score fantasy points. So that's why we say this is one of the ideal games to target. Now, the low spread also means that the game is likely to stay close throughout. So that means if you're using any of the guys who you normally see 30 to 35 minutes on these teams, this should be a game where they do see those 30 to 35 minutes because, if the game is going to stay close, they're not going to lose out on that fourth quarter rotation like you do in a 20-point blowout. You might even see some of these guys play a little bit more because in a close game, sometimes, normally a coach will give a guy 3 or 4 or 5 minutes rest. Maybe he cuts it down by a minute or two in a close game like this in order to have his best players on the floor more. So like I said, these are the ideal games that we look to target, the ones with the high totals and the low spreads. In games like this, the kind of guys that you want to target is basically everybody. Everybody's in play in a game like this. The superstars should perform towards their ceiling values, which make all of them guys that you want to look at. The fringe players, the guys who are only $4,000 or $5,000, if they're normally averaging somewhere between 16 and 25 fantasy points, which is about what you would need from a guy who's $4,000 if you can get towards the higher end of that. A game like this is the game where that guy normally does get to his higher end. Maybe he grabs an extra rebound or has an extra assist and scores an extra point or two. That might not sound like a lot, but if you average 18 points a game, the extra 2 points that you score for the extra bucket gets you up to 20. The extra assist gets you to 21 and a half. The extra rebound gets you to 22.75. Now, if you're a guy who's slightly below $4,000, that's 6x value. So you would be a useful player on a site like DraftKings on a night like that. So that's why we say in this kind of game, everybody's in play. All the guys who are going to see minutes on the floor are probably going to play closer to their ceiling values in games like this. These are also the games that tend to produce some of those crazy upside performances. We've seen it already this year with guys playing against the Sacramento Kings and the Houston Rockets for that matter, which is why I put those two teams over on the side as a good example of this. Against the Sacramento Kings this year, we've seen Joe Johnson put up 50 fantasy points. Thad Young put up 50 fantasy points. Guys have come back a couple days later. I think LeBron had, one of his better games, 65 or 66 fantasy points when they played the Sacramento Kings. And the same thing goes for the Houston Rockets. We've seen guys put up some really big numbers against the Rockets because they play at that high pace. They tend to have high totals. And because they do have some good players and some good scorers on that team, they tend to not get blown out and stay in games. So they tend to have a lot of games with high totals and low spreads, both of these teams. And that's why these are two of the teams that we like to target players on and also players against in daily fantasy. The next game type we're going to look at is a game with a low total and a high spread. And as you can see on the left-hand side, there's a big caution sign there because these games are ones that are pretty much the worst games that you want to be targeting. The low total likely means it's a slower pace, likely means less shots, less possessions overall, less chances for rebounds, for assists. Basically the complete opposite of everything we just said about the last game type. The high spread in this game also means there's a risk of blowout. So the reason we like the low spread in the last game is because it kind of guarantees or at least paints a good picture that there's a high probability our players are going to play their full amount of minutes in the fourth quarter. A game like this that has a high spread probably is going to turn into a blowout at some point. If that blowout happens in the third quarter, you may not get that last rotation, that last 5 or 6 minutes at the end of the game that you usually get from some of the stars that you might want to roster here. So that's why in a low total game, if there's not a lot of points scored and these guys aren't going to be playing their full allotment of minutes, it's pretty much a double whammy of things that can go wrong for you. And that's why these are some of the worst games to targets. High price stars in these types of games definitely tend to miss value or to underperform their value overall. If you look at the game log for Oklahoma City, Russell Westbrook has been one of the most consistent fantasy performers all year. But there are games where he misses value, and most of those games tend to be ones where you either see, it's very rare that Oklahoma City is getting blown out, but in the games where you see that they win by 18, 25, 30 points, there's definitely some of those games, or actually most of those games, where you'll see Russell Westbrook play less minutes. And when he plays less minutes, because it's a low total and a high spread game, those are the days where he tends to only put up maybe 28 minutes and 42 fantasy points or something along those lines. When you're looking at who you want to roster from a game with a low total and a high spread, I'm going to be honest with you guys. If anybody, I wouldn't want more than maybe one guy from one of these games. What I like to do with games like this sometimes is maybe take a guy who's getting some extra minutes due to an injury that would also probably stay in a blowout. So if you have a guy who normally comes off the bench, but because the starter is hurt, he's going to be starting, and he's also a guy who normally gets in there at the end of the game in garbage time. This is usually when you see like some of these young players that get, promoted to the starting lineup. Like Devin Booker is a good example of this, and Archie Goodwin. These are guys that got promoted, so they're getting more minutes. And then even if their team's getting blown out, they're still getting time on the floor. That would be the only type of player that I would want to look for in a low total, high spread game. The next kind of game we're going to talk about is a game that has both a low total and a low spread. So this is a spot where I think you can use some guys, but I wouldn't want to be heavy. I wouldn't want to have like a stack of a game like this. But I do think that players from this type of game are usable. The low total is obviously never ideal, but we do still see some guys that put up some big numbers even in low total games. There's always one or two on either side of the game, excuse me, that do wind up having a pretty solid fantasy night. Low spreads are actually good, as we said before, because that means the game stays close and these guys are going to get their full allotment of runs. Now, the reason why some of these games usually turn out low total, low spread is for one of two reasons. Either one of these or both of these defenses is very good, and because of that, they don't expect them to give up a lot of points. And the other reason why these games tend to have, these low totals is also because the pace that some of these teams play at. Some of these teams just play at a really slow pace. It doesn't mean that they're going to shut everybody down on the other side, for the opposing offense. But what it does mean is that there's going to be less of a chance that guy goes off for, an upside 70, 75 point game, because there's going to be less possessions in the game. So those are the two times that we see it. Now, a lot of times in these matchups, there's still one or two guys that outperforms. And the reason for that is a lot of times the team will be really good defensively in 2 or 3 spots. And if a team is good defensively in 2 or 3 spots, a lot of the extra, the extra shots, the extra usage, the guy who has the best matchup tends to get the ball a little more in some of these games. So we saw it the other day with, Rodney Hood. Rodney Hood is a guy who is not the number one option on his team by any stretch. His team plays in a lot of these low total, low spread games, but he put up some big games recently where he went for like 30 to 35 fantasy points, basically because that's where everything comes out when he winds up at the end. He's a guy that if the other guys have tough matchups, he's a guy that can actually score. So when he gets a little bit more usage, he can raise up his fantasy value. So a guy like Rodney Hood would be somebody that you could look at in a game like this. I also really like to look at a guy like Kemba Walker, who plays in a lot of low total, low spread games with his team with Charlotte. When Nick Batum and everybody else was out, Kemba put up some big performances in these low total games because he's a guy that gets high usage on his team. So if you're looking for guys that you want to use in a low total, low spread game, if there's a good matchup for a high usage guy, I still think that he can put up a big number. It would be akin to maybe looking at a guy like Brook Lopez, who's a high usage guy. If he's in a low total, low spread game, looking at a guy like Kemba Walker, who has high usage when everybody else was out, not so much so now that Batum and everybody else came back. But if you can find those high usage guys in these low total, low spread games, I think there is a chance that they can still outperform. So those guys are still going to be on the table for me. The last type of game we're going to look at is the high total, high spread game. The favored team is the only one I think you can look at to target here. But I think that people tend to shy away from teams that are, favored in a high total, high spread game. And I don't really think they should. And a good example of this is every game that the Golden State Warriors have played so far this year. The Golden State Warriors tend to blow teams out by 15, 20 points, which is something that you got to be concerned about if they don't get to play in the fourth quarter. But even when they haven't played in the fourth quarter, we've seen guys on Golden State put up a triple-double in 3 quarters like Draymond Green. Or we've seen, Steph Curry go off for 65 fantasy points by the end of the third quarter with, 8 3-pointers made and 10 assists and, 30-something points and a couple steals. So it doesn't mean that guys can't make value. If you're in a high total game, that means a lot of points are going to be scored. If there's also a high spread, it means there's blowout risk, but it's not a guarantee that there's the blowout. The game could stay within 5 points until the last 3 or 4 minutes. And when the starters come out on the floor, they can just wind up blowing it open and winning by 15 or 20 points. For the game to turn into a blowout before the fourth quarter, you still need guys to put up some big numbers. I mean, how many times have we seen Golden State or Oklahoma City, have like 80 or 90 points at the end of the third quarter? There's been a lot of games this year where stuff like that has happened. And in order to get to 80 or 90 points, you're still going to need a Steph Curry to go nuts or a Russell Westbrook to have a triple-double in 3 quarters. So I still think you can look at some of the stars. I still think some of the guys are in play. Of course, anybody who you can see also staying in there, even if the game does turn into a blowout. So if there's injury situations or if there's just a rotation that a team has where they don't have a lot of guys that play that position, or if that's the guy that the coach, like Kawhi Leonard, that the coach just leaves in there for a few extra minutes, whether it's a blowout or it's close. Popovich tends to sit some of the older guys, but Kawhi sometimes will play 32 to 35 minutes, even in a game that they have pretty well in hand. In those situations, I still think there are guys you can look at there. So high total, high spread games, also a place that you can look for some fantasy options. Although, it's more of a strategy that you really want to use in GPPs. It's tough to have a lot of guys from these high total, high spread games in your cash game rosters, because in your cash game rosters, if the game does turn into a blowout and they do underperform, it could really be a big hit for you. So in cash games, you definitely want to be looking for the games that have the high totals and the low spreads. In any type of game, we definitely don't want to be looking at low total games that have high spreads. In the other 2 types of games, low total, low spread, high total, high spread, there are guys you can look for. You mostly want to look for the guys who are going to be on the team that's favored. Usually the way to go, because they're going to score a few more points at the very least. The team that's favored usually has more guys that wind up paying off their price tag. So be wary of the underdogs in those games. The favorites, those guys are still in play. But the more guys and the more games you can find with the high totals and the low spreads, those are really the ones that you want to be targeting. So thank you guys for joining us here for our DraftKings NBA tips during the All-Star break. Hopefully you have a better idea now of how to use the Vegas lines and which kind of guys you want to be targeting in those games that, we do find the Vegas lines that we're looking for here. So thanks for joining us here at rotocurve.com. And as always, stay classy, DFS.